Hello, everybody, and welcome back to that Milan podcast. We double dip this week. Martino Puccio, Matt Santangelo alongside you, as you guys can see. Subscribe and follow us here on the channel and that Milan podcast, Apple and Spotify, everywhere else that you can find us. You can check out the previous episode earlier this week with Ali Fisher of SempreMilan.com talking about extensions for Tijani Reinders, Teo Hernandez, Mike Magnan, and Matteo Gabbia, as well as a little dip into the January transfer market off of Zlatan's interesting comments. That article is in the description of that video, so be sure to check all of that out. Again, fun episode. So again, Milan are back, Santangelo. So obviously we know they face off against Juventus this weekend. A rather big match between these two. Obviously, Juve 6 wins, 6 draws, 0 losses in Serie A. Milan, not the case. We are behind them by a few points. No Dusan Vlahovic for Juventus heading into this one. This one's going to be at the San Siro on Saturday, noon time for Milan. It's very interesting, obviously, the way this club has been this season. We can kind of go back and forth on whether or not they've played well or they are a good team. Fact is, oddly enough, in some of these matches, they're stepping up against the bigger opponents, maybe outside of Liverpool. Even Liverpool, they played okay for a time. But this one against Juve, when you drop points against the sides that Milan have dropped points against, the Torinos, the Parmas, the Cagliaris recently, what do they have to do, Matt? They have to win these matches. So what is your confidence level heading into this? Juve not necessarily the same after losing Bremer defensively. Milan's attack is really sound so far this season, but we know how shaky we are at the back. What are you kind of looking towards in this one that kind of would lean in the direction of Milan picking up 3 points? Because, again, they pick up 3 points here. I still believe morale can be higher because if you beat Juve, who haven't lost a game in Serie A, Inter, Real Madrid, you have to have some more confidence heading into certain competitions and matches. But, again, we see them falter. Chiefy is also the ref for this one. So what are your thoughts heading into this one?
I'm cautiously optimistic about this one, which, if you guys have tuned into our recordings and our match previews, that hasn't been the case really much at all this year, just because of how up and down we've been. But you just talked about some of the key results we had, and we have it in our locker. We're capable of playing a really good performance against a really good team and getting a victory. So that's kind of where I'm at there. I mean, I think that, you look at Juventus, right, because they haven't lost a game. So until someone can beat them and give you the blueprint to beat them, ultimately, you don't really know what kind of the more or less the best way to go about them, because they have players who are tricky in the attack that can create, do some damage. I know Dusan Vlahovic, which we'll talk about, is not going to be in this game, but Yildiz, they have Chico Conceição, they have guys that can really make the difference. And Coop Miners and Nico Gonzalez, they've had some injuries there, but when you look at the personnel, they have some names there that can really inflict some damage, and Serie A guys that have inflicted damage on Milan in past years. So I think that it really just depends on how Milan want to approach this. You coming out of international break. Thankfully, no major glaring injuries, which is always a concern and gives you pause going into these international breaks, because Juventus actually suffered a big injury to Cabal, and it looks like he's going to be out for a long time.
They have quite a few injuries. Yeah. Not even to mention Douglas Luiz. You mentioned Gonzalez as well is going to miss the game. I believe Coop Miner should be fine for this one. So Milik came back to training as well. He had a meniscus issue.
They're banged up. They're kind of what we had last year.
I've seen rumors that Timothy Weah might be starting as a striker, or some fans, Juventini, want him to start. So again, for a shaky Milan defense, Matt, this is kind of, I wouldn't say advantage Milan because they're so bad back there, but this is probably best case scenario against a side that is rather inconsistent with scoring. Yildiz now is phenomenal. I think he's one of the best young players in the league. That match against Inter was sensational. It doesn't seem like the moment is too big for him.
Yeah,
I think that's a huge and key matchup in this one, because him versus any Milan right back, doesn't matter who's starting, it's an advantage to
Yeah.
Juve, or most of the time any team. But Juve's organization as a squad and what Thiago Motta has done is difficult to break down. There's no denying it. However, when there's someone like Bremer not there who invokes fear, in my opinion, it can be worrisome for Juve, because I think with an attack like Milan, which could be so dynamic at times, it could be worrisome, because the matches in which Juve have played poorly in at times, right? If I just want to like scroll through some of their fixtures where they've faltered a bit, 2 goals conceded to Parma, 4 goals conceded to Inter, and that was after they barely conceded all season long in Serie A. I think their first goal of the season they conceded was against Cagliari in a 1-1 draw there. They have been basically either shutting clubs out or, playing in these really tight games where they end up drawing, because it was the Inter game was completely bizarre. If you ever caught that one, I mean, the 4-4 was completely uncharacteristic of them. It's a tough read, just not only because of where Juve are at injury wise and where Milan are at just in general. Yeah, so like, what who do you think has the advantage in this one? I'm inclined to say Milan, but they're no way they're in the clear for this. That like, oh yeah, this I feel confident about 3 points. I don't think we've ever said or thought that about this team this year.
Well, I mean, I think that I feel more confident in a Milan victory in this one. I'm not saying that, they're the foregone conclusion outright favorite.
Sure.
Obviously, they don't deserve that praise. They don't deserve us having that confidence in them. But I think that there's a couple ways you can look at this, right? You can see, well, is Thiago Motta, given all the injuries they're dealing with, does he play a little bit more conservatively? And if he plays a little bit more conservatively and he tries to stay structured, defensively sound, and be that type of team, well, I think Milan might have some trouble, because Paulo Fonseca has mentioned it, right? It's easier to play against like a Real Madrid or some of these other teams that like to go at you and put numbers forward, and it kind of leaves them exposed and the game kind of gets cagey and back and forth. Whereas if Juventus play the opposite way, right, where they, go back to the Max Allegri way of like, we're going to hunker down, we're going to defend, and that's where it really doesn't favor Milan, because that's where they have trouble breaking teams down. Milan love that space. They welcome a bit more of an open game. So it's difficult to say. I think that we have to give credit to the job that Thiago Motta has done. I mean, it's not easy losing Bremer. It's not easy losing the guys that he's had. He hasn't really had a prolonged, consistent stretch of healthy players that he brought in, right?
Yeah.
Where, you look at the guys they brought in on paper, if you're looking at them, you're like, okay, they have a really strong team here. But we haven't seen that sort of consistency as far as like a consistent 11 with health on their side and all those sorts of things. But I think you make a good point with Milan's attack, right? That's their big strength, right? And Rafa has come on really, really well in recent weeks, which is great timing for this match, right? Pulisic is on fire for club and country. He continues to score. He continues to provide assists. And Alvaro Morata, in a bit of a revenge game, I know people kind of like to use that term very loosely. It could be a player that gets cut and it's like, oh, it's a revenge game. It's like, no, like there's no ill will. It's not like, he left on bad terms. But there's a lot at stake here. And I think that, look, Milan in this environment at San Siro, off the international break, stumbling week to week, trying to get some sort of semblance of consistency in terms of form, I think that they're going to come out with something in this one. I'm not saying it's going to be a victory. I think that what Milan truly needs to avoid is the fatal errors defensively. And that sounds cliche and it sounds like the low-hanging
fruit. It's true. It's like the main issue.
Look what happened in the fixture last year, where Milan were the better side in that game against Juventus. They got a red card. I think it was Vlahovic Out, and then Locatelli gets a goal. And that was the end of the game. That was it.
Yeah. That one was, that was more so about like the awful era that like Chow was having in some of these.
It's one moment. It's one singular moment where if Milan switch off, that's where they really put themselves
didn't do
in
much
trouble. If they're composed defensively, we keep our shape. I don't think that Juventus are going to trouble us too much. And for that reason, that's why, again, I feel cautiously optimistic. And I say cautiously with emphasis because, we could have our guys playing in good form and we could do all these sorts of things, but we've been susceptible to committing that one big mistake, and it's like that's why this team's not going anywhere. So
Yeah.
until they prove that they can avoid that, then I think that we still
For
have
like
to
a
have that
month.
cautious optimism.
Yes, for like a month, please. I don't know. Maybe it's a bit of a small note, but the 2 games after international break that Milan have played so far this season, they have been victorious. Venezia, Udinese. With the Udinese one, I thought we played well again, as I had mentioned. The Venezia one was probably the best performance of the season outside of Real Madrid. So yeah, I mean, listen, I think there's some positives for Milan. I think I want to talk about a little bit more of the injuries and absences for Juve here. To me, I mean, Koop Miners is sensational. I think he struggled a little bit integrating his role into the squad. Again, as you mentioned, like Malta hasn't had the ability to get all of his signings in on top of implementing a new system and having everybody sync all together. Douglas Luiz has struggled, I thought, mightily since he's come on.
Yeah.
Nico Gonzalez, tremendous work rate type of player, obviously has had the injuries, a really poor finisher. Juve, kind of similar to Milan, they have a dynamic attack at times and crafty players, but the finishing is just not there for either team. We see the amount of chances that Vlahovic himself has missed. We see Morata, Leao, and a couple of other players miss time and time again for Milan. But the options for Juve in terms of dynamic attack and scoring, it's not really there. I think it's going to have to actually come down to what you were mentioning, individualistic errors from Milan and probably that right side being incredibly weak. I do think the leash is becoming shorter and shorter for a player like Emerson Royale. There seems to be a little bit more trust with Yunus Musa coming in, not necessarily being a right back in a back four, but also this sort of hybrid right wing back where he's sort of like allowed to go forward and push up further, but also being this workhorse down the right flank where he's winning balls back. And, you know, I think he's been better in terms of his decision-making defensively, and I think that's a huge boost for him. You mentioned revenge games with Pierre Kalulu as well. Well, your revenge game for Morata, Pierre Kalulu comes back to face Milan for the first time. That'll be very interesting. For me, I see kind of more of a draw playing out here if Milan commits stupid errors. But this is set up for Milan to win. This is the 3 points. If like we're being honest here about what expectations should be on paper for where Milan are at, who Juve are missing, Milan should win this game. There aren't any excuses for it. I respect what this Juve side has done so far in Serie A. There's no denying it. But ultimately, when the players that are missing for Juve are currently absent, and you're at home, and you're
let's show us something. Come on, show us something.
There's zero excuses, especially when we see what happens against Real Madrid. Again, I know the Real Madrid and Inter games, like they're one-off games. We've seen the larger picture of where Milan have been at. But again, this very important stretch of games, right, to bring up, and I know I mentioned the injuries, but this is who Milan have. They have, it's a quick turnaround too, because they play on Tuesday against Slovan Bratislava. So you have them, Slovan, and then Empoli, and then Sassuolo. And then even if you want to go a little bit further with Atalanta, from November 23rd to December 6th, Milan are playing 5 matches. So it's not only important to pick up the 3 points in this one, and these are also across 3 different competitions. We have Serie A, Champions League, and Coppa Italia and Sassuolo. So it's even more important to pick up the 3 points here because, again, with Empoli, you can't drop points against sides like that. The Juve one, much like when Juve faced us in the past, I think you remember, I think when we finished top 4 of the year, Inter won the Scudetto with Conte, Milan had like a B lineup against Juve, and Chiesa and Dybala absolutely destroyed Milan. And it was more so of like, okay, well, if Milan got anything out of that, it was great because of the absences. It's sort of kind of the opposite right now.
Right.
Milan have to get the result. On paper, I guess you could say a draw is okay, but to me, it's unacceptable. I don't know.
You look at the fact that it's like everyone kind of, draws up this this potential result is like if you get a draw, it's against Juve, so like you can't guarantee those as wins, and that's kind of
Yeah,
how
exactly. Yeah.
people are led to believe.
And they haven't lost yet.
Yeah, and they haven't lost, right? So as I mentioned, like they're unbeaten for all their flaws this year, for the points that they have dropped, right? Because they've been in advantageous positions and they've either not capitalized on chances, and then all of a sudden that team comes back and gets a draw. I think it was the Cagliari game. That was the prime example of it. Like Vlahovic had a clear chance. They could have won that game 2-1, and that game was 1-1, and there you go, right? So I think that this has to be a win. I think at some point, you mentioned the games. You mentioned the volume of games. You mentioned also that it's 3 competitions. This is where a lot of that's going to be called on for Fonseca to see how he manages rotation, right? Because
11 different lineups in 15 matches.
right. So that's another test for him. But I think from a seasonal standpoint, from a morale standpoint, this has to be a win, in my opinion, when you look at all the factors in the equation. It has to be. And I hate to say a match against Juve because I respect them. I respect their history and obviously is an top Italian club, but they have to get a win in this one. They have to.
Yeah, I think you're right. Considering where you drop points, right?
Yeah.
Which is what we talk about all the time.
They haven't due to their own fatal flaws and mistakes, they're not afforded the luxury of a draw here.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, we talk about this all the time. We have for years. We mention it often on podcasts. When you drop points against the lower sided teams in Serie A, there's only one way to make up for it in the most difficult of matches. Because sure, all 3 points are the same, but they're really not. Because they're really not. And when you host at home, and this is why it's going to be difficult for Milan in the second half of the season. Inter, it's not really a home match. Like, sure, like on paper, it's a home match, but it's still a derby, right? You still have to play another one of those. You hosted Napoli at home with all those absences. So now you have to make up for it on the road at the Maradona. So that's a really difficult fixture. You'll have Fiorentina at home. You still have to play Lazio at home, I believe. Roma, they still haven't played yet. Juve, they drop points here. Guess what? You have to go and beat them away in the second half of the season when you would assume are healthier. So Milan really don't have much leeway here, and the pressure would only mount if they get a good result. I think Juve a little bit more with house money. I know their performances have not been great. 6 draws, sort of teetering on the line of like, will they drop points here or not? So I find that very interesting. You talk about continuity. Matteo Gabbia had returned to training. He's been expected to possibly make an appearance. He's going to be with the team. Right now, reports are saying Fikayo Tomori has locked down that starting role for this one, which I'm happy about. The decision is up between Gabbia and Ciao. We know Gabbia has not played, I believe, since the Fiorentina match. So it's been quite some time now. Yeah. That's quite some time. With the way Milan play, Ciao has done fairly well since he has gotten back into the 11 after, his struggles, which have been well documented. We mentioned the quick turnarounds of all these matches. Would you start Matteo Gabbia in this match?
I've always been a believer that if you're ready to go, you're ready to go. Like it's one of those things where it's like, oh, he's making his way back. Everyone's like, maybe ease him back in. I'm like, if you're ready to get called up and you're ready to train, then you're ready for selection, in my opinion. That's my view on it. I know some people could weigh the intensity and the weight of the fixture and say, well, maybe you bring him back for the Slava game on the Champions League. Give him a couple more days. But I think, again, as I want to reiterate, Milan haven't given themselves that luxury of being able to say, hey, Gabbia, we're going to give you a little extra time. We're in a great position. We're playing well. Defensively, we're fine. They need their best guys. And in my view, Gabbia is one of their best defenders right now, maybe their best defenders. If you look at the consistency and the body of work this season, and dare I say, since 2024 started, he's probably been our best defender. So yes. I think if he's available and he's ready to go, my guess is Fonseca is going to start him. Do I have growing confidence in Malick Thiaw? I do. But I think that's sort of red card lingers, because in big games he's like that he gets into those positions where he gets caught out and he pulls the guy down, and now it's like a red card, and it's like we can't afford that, as I mentioned, in a match like this. The margins are so fine. We're not built like the type of team that if we're down a guy, we're somehow going to just make it work and we're going to win. I know the Udinese game, that was more of an outlier, but it's Udinese, no disrespect. Yeah. So I'd like to see Gabbia. I feel more confident with Gabbia.
They were down a man.
I think what you mentioned and Ali mentioned on our extension episode, again, guys, go check that out, was that seems like the most balanced CB pairing that we have at the moment. We hope that Malik Chow can emerge and get back to previous form. But as of right now in a big match, I trust Gabbia more than I trust Malik Chow, even if he is just coming back, which I know people will have concern.
I mean, he doesn't have to play the full 90. We've seen players been subbed off. Fonseca has made later subs like that. He did against Real Madrid. I believe Tomori got on.
Yeah.
Or no, it wasn't Tomori. It could have been someone else. Could have been Pavlovic. Pavlovic should not be getting anywhere near this. I think Pavlovic should sit for like a month. Put him in against Sassuolo. I mean, this guy is... Shout out to Nemanja, because he completely called this. The guy is like volatile. He is a Serbian Paletta at this point. Like, it's just... This guy, I think he is incredibly raw as a player. Just to talk on Pavlovic for a moment in time. But very similar to what Chow was last year, sometimes you just need to sit back and watch, because every single move, decision.
But Martino, my argument against that is, all right, so like in NFL terms, right, everyone will say like if a prospect or draft pick just
quarterback has to sit. Yeah.
Oh, he should observe. Like, look at how the more veteran quarterback manages the game. If Pavlovic is on the bench, he's watching us defend, and we've been defending poorly. So, like, what is he watching?
Well, I will say this: it comes from this whole thing of like, oh, why is like a bad player telling someone like or giving someone advice?
Yeah.
The point is they know what they do wrong, so they can learn from something.
Yeah.
So like even in moments of negativity, you could learn what not to do, right? Because clearly when he is on the pitch, he is the biggest liability defensively next to Emerson Royale. And it's a bigger issue. Like Fofana, like the Fofana goal. Well, it was his fault, right? You could argue Fofana on that goal against Cagliari with the pass back. Also at the same time, what was Pavlovic doing in that moment? Where he's pushing up forward when the ball is getting back to him. He is way too aggressive. We don't know what sort of instructions he is getting from Paulo Fonseca on that front. But also it's sort of like, okay, don't push forward when the ball is in your defensive third.
Yeah.
Why is that ever a situation when Cagliari are breathing down your neck? It's not like, oh, they haven't had any chances all day. I could take this sort of risk. No, brother, they could have scored 5 on you guys. What are we doing here?
That's like, so for those reasons that you mentioned, like that's where even if it's an 85% Gabbia, I just have
of course.
confidence in him, because he seems like he struggled at this club before. He's went away and then he's come back and he seems to have figured it out. I'm not saying he's a flawless defender and
no
a risk that he can make a mistake, because that's the sport.
They haven't had a defender.
He's that one type of defender in our team that I feel right now, knock on wood, that I'm the most sure of is going to make the right decision when he's put in that difficult circumstance. Like he'll play the safe ball. He'll play safe defensively. He'll come back, and Tomori will be the guy that plays a little bit higher. Whereas with like Pavlovic, it's like he will go on one of those, like he'll push up and I'm like, bro, what are you doing? You're like Teo. Like Teo just goes on one of these crazy rogue runs and you're like, Teo, like come back, and then he'll score a goal. You're like, okay. But like
Teo at least has the pace.
Yeah, because he has the pace, but it's like Pavlovic sometimes gets too caught up in trying to,
and then his recoveries are usually tackles. He thinks it's like 2005, which he was born around that time. So it's to me, it's just a little too volatile right now. And this was the issue again that we talked about with Milan and their transfer market over the summer. You didn't get a solidified true center back. And again, this is also like if Tomori was actually playing like his best self, then we wouldn't really be having these questions because it would be Tomori Gabbia. I think they can complement each other. Continuity is the word of the day. If Fonseca can get some continuity at the back four, which we've all been screaming for, and I understand why he's rotating. There's been a little bit of injuries, but also at the same time, assimilation. For me, it's Teo, Gabbia, Tomori, and then Emerson Royale, I guess. I mean, we don't even have a say at the right back. We're just going to slot him in. But yeah.
Well, I can give you what
70 minutes of Gabbia, I think, can work and go from there, or just reevaluate after that. Go ahead real quick before we move on to the final.
No, I was going to say I can give you the projected 11, but I don't know. Gazzetta kind of set up their website a little bit differently now. Normally, Gazzetta,
it's not a big deal. Regardless, Milan are going to have to field their best 11 for this one to get those 3 points. Again, it's going to be a doozy. Predictions before we go into answering some of these questions here. I'll go first.
2-1. 2-1 Rafa goal too. Rafa scores.
Why do you just like steal my stuff, bro?
I don't know.
I do feel 2-1. I think the most likely is a 2-2 draw, actually. I know Juve don't really have that firepower, but Milan's defense is so faulty, and I think set pieces will be a big factor in this one. Juve have been shaky since the injuries. I don't think they've really faced this dynamic of an attack outside of Inter, and they conceded 4 against Inter. So I could definitely see some of that. They've struggled in Champions League as well at times.
Yeah.
So Milan play more of that Champions League modern European style, which is obviously why Fonseca makes the comments that he makes. So 2-1, not going to be shocked at all if Milan draw this, and we're all here talking.
I think the one thing too, just to kind of hammer down this final point, is I think that when you look at the way that Juventus have played so far under Thiago Motta, their record, the way they've gone about this season, both domestically and in Europe, I think that they're still a flawed team. Like some of that Allegri-ism still kind of like lingers and festers within this team because there's still some pieces from his era that are still at the club. But I think generally speaking, the vibe and feeling around Juventus from their fan base, from what I'm seeing, is like they know it's going to – the injuries, they know that there's an adjustment phase here with this transition to a new coach. Yeah. They're kind of like content with like, okay, these are the growing pains of like a new coach that we really like, because there are things that Motta has done so far that are really good, and then like the chance creation, the integration of some of these younger players and putting them in key roles like Yildiz specifically. So I think that yes, while they're still doing some things right, they're still with injuries and again adjustments like Milan are making with a new coach and new players, still trying to find their footing and their right consistency. And I think for the timing of this game, I think Milan, again, 2-1 is like a narrow result. Like I'm talking like they get a goal in like the 79th minute and it's like just enough.
I agree. I could definitely see that happening. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. Leave us your predictions in the comments. Moving on to the final segment and part, maybe we'll touch upon one other thing that popped up. I'll mention it. Ahmed, a good friend, asks who starts as our center back duo. We already covered that, so good for you there. Abdul Manaf Isa has asked, why can't Milan find consistency in winning games? Pretty sure we kind of covered that the entire podcast. It's just about continuity and solidity at the back line, I think, is the biggest issue. Depth in the midfield, I would argue as well. When Milan control the center of the pitch, Milan are a really difficult team to beat. I don't think there are that many teams out there that could actually handily beat them. However, they rarely do that on top of the defense. So I kind of, that's how I view it. That's why there's consistency issues. And again, as I mentioned, that statistic, 11 different lineups in 15 matches.
Yeah.
There is no consistency throughout. And there haven't been that many injuries, knock on wood.
Which is strange too, because you mentioned injuries that we've been lucky enough to avoid the serious plague there.
It's such a coincidence, isn't it?
But you look at this Milan team and you look at the fact that, like you mentioned, right, 11 different starting 11s in these games, where it's like you'd think that that's a number that comes up because of injuries. right? But
Correct.
really,
Yeah.
this has been an issue more so at Fonseca,
Fonseca
being able
tinkering
to
constantly.
being able to trust. And I think if you go through position by position, our team, you would kind of scratch your head a little bit because it seems like more or less
It's pretty simple.
it's pretty simple to be like, who's your best 11? They're like Mike, okay, Teo, Gabbia Tomori, Fofana, Binders, Pulisic, Leao,
And
Rafa.
there's
It's like,
been some extenuating circumstances, right? Like Teo misses the first game
right, cards
because of
and
that. Calabria and Emerson Royale, they changed it up. Benacer's injury had changed things. I mean, like the first starting lineup against Torino, we had Calabria and Salamakers playing the fullback positions with Chow starting. He unfortunately got that own goal. But then you have Benacer and Loftus-Cheek as the double pivot,
yeah,
and Jovic is starting up top. We haven't seen anything like that since. We've seen the striker position change because Morata picked up a slight knock. He had a head injury. Tammy's been hurt at the striker position as well. Teo gets bench and or suspended, or we had Alexis Salamaker starting there. We mentioned the rotations at the center back position, the injuries and rotations in the midfield position, as well as Fofana arriving late. There's so many extenuating circumstances there. But now we're sort of like at that part of the season where it doesn't hold any validity in terms of,
right,
oh yeah,
right.
guys are trying to get
Yeah,
integrated in there. There's no injuries. Everyone that's like kind of been here right now that has a starting position has pretty much solidified themselves in
yeah,
terms of new signings, right? Like new signings within the starting 11 that are playing are largely Emerson Royale, Fofana. There hasn't been, that sort of player in there. And again, he doesn't know what to do with the number 10 position half the time
yeah,
or whether to use one. So we've kind of heard this from Tom Scholes and other people who watch Fonseca much more closely, is that Fonseca's teams tend to hit strides in the middle of the season because he struggles to figure out what works. And
yeah.
this is part of the problem as to why Milan could be deemed too big of a job for him, because you don't have time. It's now.
You don't have 20 match days. You don't have until January to all of a sudden get it.
But now that I think about it, we also are with an ownership that was okay with what was happening last year with Pioli.
Yeah,
Where they're okay. Hey, they're right outside the top 4. Like, for example, Milan have a game in hand with Juventus here because of the Bologna match being suspended. In theory, Milan win this game. They're 3 points behind Juve with a match in hand. They're not that far off of Inter, the Fiorentinas, obviously even the Napolis of the world with the match in hand. So the way they look at it is like, why are we sacking a manager if we're not that far off? We struggled to get out of the gates,
yeah,
and it would cost us more money to pay another manager. And that's the difference again. If you want to go with ownership and what their standards are and what Milanisti think their standards and expectations should be, which is a common theme. Solo ask, and this is the last question before I just want a quick thought from you on a player that Milan have been linked to. Solo asks, will Teo be getting the Leao treatment, or Fonseca will be too scared to try it against Juventus? I think Teo is
he's starting.
He's playing in this one. I don't think
Starting.
there's been anything like that. Rafa Leao has made public comments like regarding like the quote unquote beef between him and Fonseca. Like they've all said that it's been resolved. Again, actions can speak differently. I would say the one player that absolutely, besides Emerson Royale, because he just needs a good game in general, the one player that needs to put in a really good performance, in my opinion, is Teo.
Yeah, he has to.
He has to. He's been the most subpar out of all the best players of Milan this season. Easily. And he's not even getting like a third of the hatred.
And we talked about too, like when we were discussing his contract extension with Ali,
yes.
And Ali brought the point, like, is he like a big game player? Like, what's his record as far as like scoring in big games, producing in big games? And look, this isn't a knock on him. I love Teo. I love what he's brought to this club since he arrived.
But fair is fair.
But fair is fair. I think like we have to, we as fans and as fans that watch these guys very often and are in the know as far as like the details on wages and all these sorts of things and what's going on with their status, I think it's fair for us as fans to expect more from Teo and to ask more from our star players. Just like everyone does it with Rafa. They say he's getting paid a ton of money. He's wearing the number 10 shirt. We expect him to track back. People expect more from Maignan. So like keep that same energy when it comes to other players in this team. And that's no different with Teo. Teo needs to put in a good performances, and I don't think he's going to get benched for this, just to kind of answer the actual question, which it was posed.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that, and we'll see what happens there. Final subject, just real quick, because this came across as a Di Marzio report.
I know. Okay, I know this one. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So it's Samuele Ricci,
Mm-hmm.
or Ricci. I know some people are gonna know. I always forget the correct pronunciation. Either way, the player that I have asked for quite some time, and it always gets linked. And it's funny because I'm slowly turning into someone who wants a certain player and then they just somehow end up on Inter. It's been very infuriating. It's been similar links with Ricky there. Rumors of, because of the Zapata injury for Torino, Luka Jovic potentially involved in a deal here. And again, this would be for the summer, which was also according to Daniele Longo. I guess kind of take it with a grain of salt, but I do like talking about these sort of moves. Is he the perfect defensive midfielder profile for Milan? No. But is he a perfect fit for Milan? Yes. Finally, an Italian that is not drastically overpriced, in my opinion. And when you're dealing with Urbano Cairo, 30 million is a fair fee for a player that's familiar with the league. He's gotten way more experience. I think he's progressed
National
as a
team.
player. And this is someone that we've watched since his Empoli days and how he's grown over time. Obviously, the jump from Empoli to Milan would have been massive and it would have been hard to get minutes and all that sort of stuff. But again, proving himself at a good Serie A side, Italian, as we had mentioned as well, and you like to kind of keep those guys over the course of time. Milan don't have great midfield depth when it comes to the sort of personnel that they have. Benacer, not reliable. Musa, hot and cold, but also sort of moved around all over the place. We know what Loftus-Cheek is. At least Samuele is a better fit for a double pivot than I would say the rest of our backup midfielders, to be quite honest with you. I would welcome this move. If you could be a little aggressive in January where you throw him a bone. Again, we don't know how negotiations would go, but if you could give him Luka Jovic, move forward with that, and then on top of it, pay the price up front in January, leave him there for 6 months if it's necessary, and then get him in June.
Mm-hmm.
That all seems too logical for the way Milan operate.
Also, for the way that Urbano Cairo goes about business. So
eventually Milan have to pay up, right, Matt? They just have to be like, okay, here's the price. We're not going to haggle. Whether or not that happens, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, it's not a matter of whether we like the player or not. I don't think anyone, or few people, are going to have that sort of doubt. I think this is a really quality player, a quality Serie A player that has a lot of potential yet to be shown. And that's no indictment on him. He's just a younger player, right? We said a lot of the same things about Sandro Tonali when he was at Brescia. And we're like, he's great. He's got all this quality. It's like, okay, but we still have more. And after his first year at Milan, people were asking questions about Tonali, like what really is his potential? And he proved how prolific he was and how fantastic he was. And that's Scudetto winning season and the year after.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a matter of whether or not we can use a player of that quality. I just look at the way that Milan has gone about business. And if they're not absolutely in love with the figure, they're not going to budge. I just don't see Milan getting into a position where they're going to overpay. They're not like that. They're going to trust their scouting. And that's something that I've always sort of seen and read, from this scouting department, these directors that, we have other guys on our queue, right? We have other guys that we like that fit this profile, that fit this billing. I think it's not going to be a matter of whether the player's keen. I think that's something that Milan can really iron out the details with that in advance. It's always going to be negotiating with the club. And truth of the matter is, a player of his caliber with, a good body of work so far as a young player, getting that national team exposure and getting the exposure to, reportedly, whether you agree with or side with the reports or not, or believe them, the Manchester Cities of the world apparently are interested, right? So it's like you kind of throw all these things in a pot and you're like, how are Milan going to get this deal done for a price that they deem fit, that they deem acceptable? And I think that Milan will have to, and it's a possibility, this is my final point here, utilize Milan Futuro. Is it Kevin Zeroli in a deal plus cash? Is it somewhere where Milan use that sort of quote unquote farm system, the academy, as a way to say, hey, because they're not giving him Papega, they're not giving him some of these other guys in our team. Is it a matter of, hey, you're taking one of our young midfielders, like we want Zaroli plus cash? That's a possibility. I'm not saying I would do it. I'm not saying I would do it, but I think that people fall too in love with prospects as well. And we see this a lot of times in other sports, where if I can get a guy like Ricci, who I think is ready to go now with the project we have and what our ambitions are or should be, I think that I would be okay forfeiting a good prospect plus some cash if it can will bring down that price to bring in a player like Ricci, in my opinion.
Well, you're right, but we've also thought that they would have wanted Pobega. So, like, the fact that they wouldn't even consider Pobega, who is obviously a much more proven player. I know Zeroli's name has been leaked out there, but I think Skira was also saying that Milan had no interest in doing that over the summer. I think you raised a good point. I think it's valid. I don't kind of see that happening. And also, like,
well, I'm not saying him.
No. I know what you're saying, but like my overall point with this is sort of like, Milan don't have to do that.
No.
Right?
They can pay. They can pay for it.
They have the money.
They got the money, yeah.
Adli, Kalulu, and CDK alone. We're not even talking about their record profits, revenue, all the bullshit, right? They have literal money from transfers. Eventually, you would like to see them just go for it and get somebody. Just, you know what it is? It's a smooth transfer decision. Anyways, that'll wrap it up for us here. We just have some things to do. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Again, That Milan Podcast everywhere. Be sure to check out the Semper Milan Podcast, MLM Podcast with Gino and Max, Coast to Coast Podcast as well on Milan Weekly Podcasts channel, as well as the Milan Weekly Podcast. If we forgot some of them, Kush, Serie A, Sit Down, Old Hard Rossonero, plenty of channels and podcasts that we love. Matt, everybody can go and follow you everywhere here. Again, AC Milan Bros and at Matt_Santangelo, all the great work that you do. And again, guys, you can go and follow me at Martino_Puccio. Matt, any final comments before we head out here, or just hopefully getting a good victory?
Hopefully a winning result. I think we need it. Fans deserve to see this team win games. We've been through a lot already this year. We're at the third point of the season. Like, we're a third of the way through the season. Like, it's time to get going, boys. So hopefully Milan get the result that you and I are predicting.
Yep. Hopefully. Thank you guys so much, and see you next time.